Hello everyone. Today's video is going to be a little bit different. I decided to, since it's the month of Halloween and everybody's doing scary story stuff and videos, I thought I would do something in keeping along those lines, but I'm going to tell some true paranormal stories. A few will be of my own, and a few will be from other people or stories that I've heard. So let's get started with our first one. And this is coming from a book. It's called White Trash Tales of the Paranormal. And I think that's coming in backwards, and I don't know how to I don't know how to fix that. But it's called White Trash Tales of the Paranormal. It's by a lady named Jacqueline Bennett Schumacher. And it's basically a story about her life. She's had a lot of paranormal activity throughout her family and in her lifetime. And my phone's making funny squiggly things. Anyway, I wanted to share her story with you. And it's quite an interesting read. She's been tormented all her life. If even a part of this is true, this poor family went through so much. And you know, I saw her on a TV interview when her book first came out, and she's so sincere, and she's very shy, very ordinary type person, very down to earth, and I really believe her, and I really believe these things can happen, and they do happen to people, and I think that her stories are true, basically. I've had some things happen in my own life that were pretty bizarre, and with my family. So I do tend to think that these things really can happen. So let's get into it. I want to read one story actually out of her book. And a little background is that her grandfather was a self-proclaimed warlock. And I guess he was quite the torment of the little town that he lived in upstate New York. He tormented the people in the town. He tormented his own family. He was just an evil person, right straight through to the bone. He would put curses on people in town that he got angry with, and people actually died. It was probably a coincidence, but you never know. But they claimed that his curses were real and that he could really make things happen to you. He had, believe it or not, 22 children. Some of them followed his evil ways, and some of them went off and made a life for themselves and turned out to be good people. And I guess basically when they became of age to move away from home, they would split and just never come back. And a lot of them, their families, when they got married, their families had never met this man. They didn't want them anywhere near him. And if you read the book, you can see why. So let me just read you one story, and it's called The Card Game. Really unnerving to think that this could actually happen, but let me read it to you. It's a short one. My dad and 5 of his brothers were sitting around the kitchen table playing cards at his ma's house on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. The young men had sent their wives and babies out to pick up groceries. Needless to say, the room was thick with smoke, gaseous vapors, the aroma of beer, and foul language that could be heard above all of it. Typical poker game. The grandfather had been dead for about 5 years at this point, but the house still had the same foreboding feeling that it had when he was alive. People heard and saw things that couldn't be explained. None of the wives and children wanted to be left alone in the house. They all felt the evil and wanted to put as much distance between themselves and it. Besides, the living room scared them all. The best man at this lady's parents' wedding had killed himself in there. He'd lost an eye during World War II, and he felt like a monster. He returned to the woman that he had wed right there in the arch of these people's living room. And it was murmured It was rumored that she couldn't deal with his disfigurement and she had cheated on him. He came home to a Dear John letter. He dressed up in the very suit that he wore to his wedding, broke into the house, and hung himself right where he took his vows. Every once in a while, they said that if you came down the stairs in the middle of the night, you could see him hanging from the archway in the dark in his new blue suit. So they were glad to let the men party alone. They wanted nothing to do with the house. The men had basically all adopted the official ignore it and it will go away policy. And I think a lot of people do that. It's like, I don't want to deal with it, so I'm going to ignore it and it'll just go away. But the grandfather had not been forgotten. So the card game got to be pretty crazy. They got to be pretty wild and often erupting into playful wrestling matches in the front yard when someone felt they were cheated, or when the air got unbreathable, or when someone wanted to take the attention off their inability to play cards. They had gotten well into the third hour of playing cards when they heard a knock on the kitchen door, and her dad got up and answered it. There stood a tall, handsome, well-dressed black man. He seemed to be very personable and looked like the friendly type. His hair was long and hung in ringlets to his shoulders. I heard in town that you have a card game going. Mind if I sit in? He asked. My father's family had all been raised as bigots. They were simple people raised to have simple thoughts. They were all raised to hate, but for some reason, my dad liked the guy at once. He looked back at his brothers who were sitting at the table, and he could tell by their facial expressions that they hated the idea. But he decided, what the heck, the more the merrier. My father said, why not? My name is Bob. Come on in. These guys are my brothers. What's your name? Smith. My name is Smith. I'm not from around here. And thanks, Bob, said the stranger. He quickly entered the kitchen and took a seat at the kitchen table. He took a moment to look at the brothers and got a bead, so to speak, on them. The brothers were taking their own special brand of moment to let the guy know he wasn't wanted in the game, let alone the house. My dad was busy trying to get his brothers to knock it off, and the looks were flying and the air suddenly got tense. Are you playing for money? I have money and would love to get a poker game going, Smith quietly offered with a friendly grin on his face. Sounds great to me, they offered one by one. So out came the dollar bills, nickels, dimes, and quarters. The games began, and soon everyone was having a ball. Smith turned out to be a nice guy. Even the bigots found themselves liking him. The tense atmosphere was replaced with a more neighborly one. Unfortunately, Smith was a lousy player. He made my dad's losingest brother look like a pro. Out of nowhere, Smith's demeanor began to change. The friendly gentleman began to get intimidating. The summer air became very cold, icy cold, and they all knew what that meant. Evil was present. They sat in their chairs shivering and wishing they hadn't invited Smith into the house. He began to do slight tricks with his hands, tricks that reminded them all of the grandfather. It was as if the old man had returned in this man's body. My dad and his brothers all got scared and said that was it. They quit. They told him he could take the money if he would leave now. Smith gleefully bathed in their fear. He flicked a card onto the floor and he asked my dad to pick it up. Oh God, this wasn't a good sign. It was more like an order than a request. My dad glanced over at his younger brothers. Granted, there were 6 of them and only 1 of him, but they all knew from the atmosphere that this man they were dealing with was no man. So my dad got prepared to fight as he put his cigarette out in the ashtray. He grabbed the table with one hand and slowly bent down to pick up the card. As he reached for the card, He noticed something that made him want to scream. He looked at Smith's pant legs and recoiled at what he saw. Smith had cloven hooves. He didn't have feet. He was afraid to raise his head for what he might see. War hadn't prepared him even for this. He fought hard to stifle the screams that he heard only in his mind. He sat up straight in his chair and looked at Smith. Smith gave him an all-knowing look. My dad hated himself for inviting this man into his mom's house. His dad's brothers were asking, what was wrong? What's going on? I'll be going now, Bob. It was a pleasure to have played cards with you men. Thanks for the money, he said as he slowly rose from the table. As he gathered the money in his hands, one of my dad's brothers began to protest. Hey, that's not fair. Some of that is my money, he cried out as he grabbed for the till. Stop it. It's all his. All of it, my dad commanded. Smith and my uncle were staring each other down with both their hands in the till. Step back, leave him alone, and let him go, my dad quietly ordered. Everyone knew something was going on, but they didn't know what. Feeling the pressure from his big brother, my uncle released the money and stood back. He fixed all of his attention on Smith. Smith slowly stuffed all the money in his pockets. He shook his head and he giggled as he stood up and buttoned his coat. The giggles were so deep and throaty that it sent shivers down all their spines. How could he make that malignant sound come from his body, they wondered. The room was so quiet that it was deafening. They swore that they were so terrified that they forgot to breathe. Smith, when finally spoke in a deep baritone. The voice he had used at the table had suddenly become replaced by a thunderous and commanding noise that made the dishes and window panes quake. Excuse me. It's been a pleasure, boys. Bob, thanks for the invitation and the kindness you showed to a stranger. But next time, Bob, be careful of who or what you invite into your home, he said. With the warning, he smiled dementedly and turned and walked to the door. Only this time, the sound was different. He was making a clopping noise, one that a horse would make if one were walking by. It was so loud and distinctive that all eyes went to his feet. Smith met their frightened stares gleefully. As he held onto the door with his right hand, he once again warned the men, "Be careful who you invite into the house next time, boys." He began to cackle wildly, and he clomped his way through the door and down the stairs. They gave him a few seconds' head start, and they ran after him. They heard him clopping around the corner and up the street. They raced after him to make sure of what they saw. They had no desire to catch up to him. They just wanted to make sure they weren't nuts. But he had disappeared. When my grandfather came home, they told her what happened. She was furious. "Didn't you listen to your father at all? Evil has to be invited into your home. You invited it in. He told you never to let anyone we didn't know into the house. Now you have made your father angry," she said, talking about the grandfather. Mind you, he had been dead for 5 years already, but he still seemed to have a curse that made things happen. So anyway, that's my tale from this book. And I would like to impart, for a few minutes, a tale of my own. My mother, when she was about 17 years old, lived in West Virginia with her parents, and she had 12 brothers and sisters. And they had a ranch farm combination in a place called Postal Ridge, West Virginia. And that's where they all grew up. Well, one night, they had first let me tell you, they had a 3-story house, but they didn't have indoor plumbing. This was back in the 30s. My grandfather had built a very nice outhouse down over the hill from the house. So, and he had made this really nice sidewalk that went down to the outhouse, and I'd been there many times. He really had it set up nice, for an outhouse. But one night while she was getting ready for bed, she decided to take one last trip down to the outhouse. Well, she picked up her lantern and started down the sidewalk, and she said about, maybe 20 yards from the outhouse, it looked like a figure had stepped out from behind the outhouse. And so she lifted her lantern to see what it was, get a better look. And she said that it was her grandfather, who had been my great-grandfather, who had, by the way, passed away the week prior to this. So it couldn't have been him. But she said she saw him. And he was standing there waving his arms, telling her to go back, telling her to get away. And, of course, it frightened her to death. She said that she ran back up to the house so fast that her feet didn't even touch the ground. And she ran up on the porch, ran into the kitchen, into the dining room where her parents were. And at that point, she's screaming and yelling and, hysterical. And there was a sheriff in the dining room with my grandparents. And they asked my mother, of course, what was wrong, what was going on. And she was so hysterical that she couldn't even talk. But she could point. So she took him out on the porch and pointed down over the hill toward the outhouse and was just standing there screaming and jumping up and down. So the sheriff and my grandfather went down over the hill with their lights and everything. And they came back a few minutes later with another gentleman. It was the criminal. He had escaped from the sheriff's office or the sheriff's jail. And he was a very dangerous man. And he was out in the countryside there somewhere. And the reason the sheriff was going to the farmhouses and stuff is to warn them that this man was armed and dangerous, and he was in their area, and to keep your doors locked and, the usual precautions, because back then people didn't even lock their doors. So that's what he was doing there. And then when my mother, of course, had her hysterics and I went down, they found the man crouching inside of the outhouse. So, of course, the sheriff apprehended him and hauled him off. And my grandparents and my mother swore till the day they passed away that my great-grandfather had come in ghost form to warn my mother to save her life. Because if she had gone on down to the outhouse or inside of it, who knows what could have happened. The guy could have killed her or taken her hostage or whatever. And they were far enough away that they wouldn't have been able to hear her yelling, even if, she had called for help. So they credit my great-grandfather's ghost for saving my mother's life. Now, I take more of a scientific view on paranormal. I've had too many things happen to say that there isn't something in our reality with us, but I personally don't believe in ghosts, but I'm not going to get into that too much because this is just a ghost story. And but I will continue this month to tell you some more ghost stories and impart some of my personal experiences and other people. And I encourage all of you, anyone listening, I challenge you to do a video on something that may have happened in your life, some paranormal experience that you just couldn't quite explain and you'd like to share it with everyone. I think it would be awesome. I think more people have these experiences than want to admit, or that are not willing to talk about it, because I don't think it's all that uncommon. I really don't, because most people, if you talk to them about it, they will tell you that they've had something, whether they've seen something, felt something, or just something weird happened. Most people have. So if you have a story, do a video. I'd love to see it. I'd love to hear your story. And that's all for today, but I will come back once a week and tell some more stories. And in keeping with the Halloween season, but I am not a paranormal investigator. I don't ever want to be. My channel is not about the paranormal. I'm just doing this for October just to share some things with you and maybe have you share some back. So you guys have a great day, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I hope you enjoyed my video, and I hope you'll come back for the next story. Thank you. Have a great night. Bye-bye.